Morning everybody, Silverbolt here. Not back for a Transformers review, going to be doing something a little bit different. We are of course coming up quite close to Order Assembly. It's now 5 weeks away, and one thing I don't want to be doing is I don't want to be making a video every week where I'm basically just shoving Order Assembly down your throats. At this stage, most of you, in fact all of you, should be aware, at least through my videos, if not through mine then through somebody else, that it's happening. You know it's happening. You know where to go to get your tickets. You know what we're going to be doing. So there we go. You know some of what's going to be happening, and there's things that myself and the rest of the committee we're still organising behind the scenes that we haven't made everyone aware of yet, but there we go. So I don't want to be shoving it down your throats. So I thought I'd do a series of videos on something different. I thought I'd do them based around film genre, and the film genre in itself of horror. Now, admittedly, there are better people out there who could do this subject a lot more justice than I could. Exaggerated Elegy springs to mind straight away. I mean, the man's intelligence and frankly his eloquence is far surpassing mine. So, but I will give it my own unique brand of making a mess of it. So there we go. I'll probably split this over several weeks, and I'm going to cover, instead of covering specific films, I'm going to cover the genre as a whole and try and put in all the nuances and the different subcontexts and all the different things throughout the ages. By ages I say about the last 120 years that we've had cinema. Now, horror films are a branch of filmography that have been around for a long time. The first genuine horror movie, and what is classed as one of the first genuine horror movies, was actually made in 1896, and it was called Le Manoir du Diable, or The Devil's Castle, and it was French, made by George Méliès, or George Méliès, or George whatever his name is. And that was so they've been around for a long time. Now, horror films, of course, the idea of horror, it's quite obvious. It's designed to horrify you, hence the name. But it's not just designed to scare you witless. It's designed to frighten you. It's designed to make you panic. It's designed to alarm you. And in some regards, it's also there to make you face your own fears. You know, it brings out the darker nature of humanity. And you know, and a lot of people associate horror films with monsters and demons and things ripping up nubile young ladies who are very often more than not in their underwear. But that's a genre of horror that I'll get to, which combines the sex with the scare, but I'll get to that. Horror films as a rule are designed to bring out humanity's fear of the dark. And to some degree, it's something we've never got over. It's a genetic imprint within ourselves. You know, most people don't like insects or spiders. Some people do. Some people love them. But most people don't like them. Or they're very, very indifferent about them. I mean, look at it this way. You know, I mean, how many people have a dog? How many people have a pet cockroach? You know, so horror films are designed to bring out mankind's primordial fear of the dark. You know, when, you know. And you know, when we were cavemen, and before that, when we were still basically walking monkeys, well, walking upright monkeys. You know, we'd live in caves, and you know, we'd always keep one eye on the door. You know, we'd always keep watch. And at first, you know, that wasn't to stop boogeymen and Frankenstein and werewolves and all that getting in, or sparkly vampires. Shall I get to that and give it a right good trashing? No, it's simply not worth my time, but there we go. They were afraid of saber-toothed tigers and mastodons, and I suppose in some regards insects. Insects carry a lot of diseases. Look at the tsetse fly in Africa. So there we go. So early scares were done then. And that's been carried forward into the horror genre throughout the ages, in that we are scared of things that are in the dark. So a lot of horror films are done at night. Would it really make as much sense if Freddy Krueger was chasing down the street in broad daylight with the birds singing and the wind whistling through the trees in a very serene way? No, it's much scarier when he's doing it in the black of night through lamppost lights. So there we go. So horror films bring out our fear of the dark, but they also bring out, in some regards, our fear of ourselves. And that's another section of horror film where it's not a big, evil, ugly, badass monster that's killing us. It's another human being. And it's something that a lot of people don't like to admit about themselves, is that within each of us there is that capacity to do great harm to our fellow man. We've been doing it for hundreds of years. Mankind spends more money on more ways to kill each other than we do to save each other. But that's a different subject entirely, in some regards. So, when it's another human doing it, then it creates a different response, because that makes us scared of the film, but also scared in some regards of ourselves, because we could do that. We could torture that young lady or that young man. We could tear them apart. We could stitch their bodies back in various different ways. So horror films have attached themselves very, very firmly in the psyche of humans. It's like roller coasters. I mean, look at it's like theme park rides in roller coasters. Roller coasters are designed to scare the living bejesus out of us, but it's a fun scare because it's an adrenaline rush. Horror films tend to be the same kind of... No, scratch that. Horror films don't tend to give us the fun scared. Horror films tend to just give us the heebie-jeebies in that kind of regard. So whereas the roller coaster, it's more an adrenaline rush, with the horror film, it's more of the rush. So that's a little something on the idea behind horror films. Now, the earliest horror films very much focused on monsters. It wasn't psycho stalkers, it wasn't humans doing horrible acts of evilness to each other. It was very much focused on monsters. I mean, the film that I mentioned earlier on, The Devil's Castle, well, that contained very much what is now considered to be stereotypical views on horror films. A bat, a medieval castle, it was dark, a demonic figure, skeletons, ghosts, witches, all that kind of thing. Now, the film was only 2 minutes long, but it was closely... well, no, it wasn't closely followed, but the film was only 2 minutes long. I have to admit, I haven't actually seen it, so I don't actually know the plot and how you can fit an entire film into 2 minutes. But then, you see, you do it on YouTube all the time. Now, of course, when, in 1896, they didn't have CGI, they didn't even have stop motion at that point, and the films were silent. So the effect, I imagine, on people watching it would have been quite profound. Because bear in mind, right, it's something they hadn't seen before. It manifested their fear of the dark. It manifested the things that, despite the fact that we in the 20th century, well, 21st century, pretty much laugh at now. I mean, atheism is something that's becoming more and more fashionable. We're losing our superstitions, fears of demons and devils and gods and I don't want to say witches because that's a bad thing to say, but for anybody who is a witch or a druid or a wicca who knows anything about that, they will understand why, because witches inherently aren't evil, but there we go. Ghosts and goblins and things like that. We're losing that fear amongst cynicism, and we're using cynicism as our shield. It's becoming our suit of armour against the things that have scared our ancestors for several thousand years. And we use science as a proof of that cynicism. We don't believe in it anymore because science can't prove that it exists. From a logical point of view, that makes perfect sense. It makes absolutely perfect sense that we don't believe in ghosts, that we don't believe in demons, that we don't believe in the devil, that we don't believe in a god, that we don't believe in the boogeyman under the couch, or the Furby behind the back of the sofa, for the simple fact that there's no scientific proof that they're real. Ghosts are a different matter entirely, because ghosts, there's, you know, for every one story about a demon appearing, there's 100 ghost stories. But again, that's getting into a bit of a tangent on other things. So, when we had the 1890s, we had the first film, The Devil's Castle, come out. Now, funnily enough, a lot of the earlier films, despite the fact that all these big blockbusters today came out of America, and to a lesser extent the UK, a lot of the earlier films didn't. The UK, of course, by 1896, the UK, of course, was very firmly set in the grip of the Victorian era, which was, we don't do any, you know, you don't show more flesh below the neck or above the ankles. You don't do, well, no, even an ankle at that point was no. But then Victorian era was very much a strange way of life, because on the surface it was very prim, proper, straight down the line, you know, sex was lie back and think of England and all this, that and the other. But underneath it, Victorian England had a very high degree of almost hedonistic indulgence. But again, that's something else that is only loosely related and allows me to irritate another point. America was not quite as Victorian in its structure, but again, it still had that. Well, we don't want to see that kind of thing. You don't want that kind of thing. So it fell to European filmmakers to make the earliest horror films, and a lot of them came out of France and Germany. One of the most memorable German ones was made in 1919, and it's one that a lot of people haven't heard of, and it's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now, instead of focusing on monsters and demons and devils and witches and all this kind of palaver, this was one of the first horror films that focused on a human. Now, when it was first released, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was based around a psychologist who was tormenting one of his victims, and it was played by Werner Krauss. Incidentally, the victim that he was played by Conrad Veidt, who was better known as the role of Major Strauss in the film Casablanca, the 1942 version. And it was brought to Hollywood. It was brought to the Americas in the 1920s as well. But they didn't like it so much because, without giving too much of the film away, Dr. Caligari was the villain. Now, they didn't like that idea because it meant that things in authority could be wrong. Things in authority could be questioned. Things in authority didn't always do the right thing. Iraq War, anybody? So they changed it to make it look like it was more of a delusional mental state of the victim. So it did take away from the actual idea that it was the doctor that was the evil bad bastard. So there we go. The next part of this, again, still staying with the early films of the 1910s and the 1920s. One of the things that, of course, came out in the early, one of the things that did, of course, come out in the early days of the 20th century were vampire films. Now, the first female vampire showed up in the film called The Vampire, but they were very much just a femme fatale style of figure. I mean, of course, we did at this point, of course, have Bram Stoker's Dracula. That, of course, was absolutely well known throughout the world over. It's only in more recent times, well, in the last 40, 50 years, we've actually realised that there was a huge connotation of sex throughout the entire book. I mean, women fell under the thrall of vampire. Harker himself is seduced and orally raped by the 3 female vampires. So, and it's something that's much more come to light in modern times, because of course we've been rather desensitised to the whole idea of sex and that. Another silent film that came out very, very early on was A Fool There Was, and that was played by Theda Bara, and she was a very famous vampire actress in the early years of the silent film. Now, of course, if I am discussing early vampire films from the 1920s, I have to, of course, mention the film Nosferatu. Now, that was again a German film, directed by Werner Herzog. And that film was groundbreaking. It did for the vampire industry what Jurassic Park did for dinosaurs, or Star Wars did for sci-fi. You know, the film was groundbreaking. It used full-on special effects in the form of prosthetic makeup, because, of course, though it was very, very heavily based on Dracula, because of copyright they couldn't actually make it as Dracula, so Nosferatu was called Olaf. It was set in the town of Bremen instead of in Transylvania, and it was just literally enough just to not get them sued. And that's where we started to get a depiction of the more monstrous side of the vampire. I mean, throughout, well, you know, further on through the years, even today, and especially today, vampires have more of a sexual allure to them. Allure? 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 How do you say allure?
Allure.
Allure.
I think.
Allure? 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 It's a French word, I don't know. You know, they're very much sex on legs. But Nosferatu gave us something different. It gave us the monster that is vampires. And of course, Nosferatu, he had big eyes, he was bald, he had big pointy ears, he had a face very much like a rat, and he had very long elongated fingers. And the film, for its time, was absolutely phenomenal. It was fantastic. When you think that they didn't have CGI, they didn't have, as a rule, even pretty much stop motion photography. It was all done with lighting and music. And of course, it did try to get a remake. They tried to remake it in 1979 with Klaus Kinski as Count Dracula, but it didn't have quite the same impact. Kind of like the way when they made King Kong in the 1930s with Kurt Russell, and one of the most ridiculous things in the whole film was some giant guy in a monkey suit wiggling his finger at a blue screen while some girl in a bikini starts crying, and the monkey's there like, ooh. That was just flipping wrong. Right, I am out of time, so for now I'm going to have to try and come back to this subject. I'm not quite done with early films, so it'll be something that I'll come back to, and then over the course of the next few weeks, probably about 3, 4, 5, I'll be going into other decades and the impact they had on the horror genre. But for now, sleep tight. Okay, one day of work and one dinner and one cup of coffee later, I am back, and I'm going to pretty much carry on from where I left off. Now, we had Nosferatu, and that of course covered one of the very 3 standard horror film monsters. The second that came next was Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's book, of course, heavily influenced. Now, one of the first influences of the Frankenstein genre was the 1914 German film Der Golem, based on the idea of a Jewish rabbi bringing to life a clay monster to protect his people. It was parodied in one of the Simpsons Treehouse of Horrors, and that gave us a very early idea of the Frankenstein idea, as in they create something that they lose control of. The next big, now these films had all done using prosthetics, and one of the first effects of special effects that we saw in a horror film was the 1914 film The Miser's Convention, where it was actually a screen transformation by using, and it was basically using a series of dissolving films one into each other to create a kind of blurring shaping effect. It was later used, of course, to depict Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the 1931 adaptation. Okay, now the next film that has become, in recent times that I'm going to mention, more well known as a musical. Andrew Lloyd Webber has covered it. Very famous, very big budget movies have been made out of it. It's a West End musical. It's Nightwish have covered some of the songs, and it's very, very well known. And then it was done by Laurie Chaney, and Laurie Chaney was a very famous director back in the early days of film, and he in 1925 released The Phantom of the Opera. Now, The Phantom of the Opera in the early versions was not this misunderstood musical genius with a bit of an obsessive compulsive disorder when it came to his theatre. Now, he was a monster, and the film was groundbreaking in what it did for the camera styles that were involved. And of course that has spun off versions of the film The Phantom of the Opera through pretty much all the decades. We had a remake in the 40s, in the 60s, we had 3 in the 80s, the 90s, and then of course leading up to the most recent one, The Phantom of the Opera itself. Another famous monster, which was similar in some regards to the Frankenstein in that it was something that was created they couldn't keep control of, was the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde films. And the most recent reincarnation of that has been it was a loosely adapted version of the story Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the form of Jekyll, starring James Nesbitt. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it's written by Doctor Who's Stephen Moffat, and it is an absolutely fantastic piece of fiction. James Nesbitt, who most people remember from his comic values in Cold Feet, does an absolutely stellar performance. Now, to round off this part of the video, I'm going to bring about the end of silent movies and the beginning of sounded movies. Still black and white, but it does start to bring out the classics of the horror genres, and that comes out into the 1930s, and it's at that point that you really start to see the rise of a studio that's very well known, Universal. So we had things like Backstairs, Waxworks, The Cat and the Canary, and various things like that. And the first proper talking horror film was made by Warner Brothers, and it was released in 1928, and it was called The Terror, and it was a stage-bound adaptation of Edgar Wallace's play regarding a haunted house that is terrorised by an escaped lunatic from an asylum. Now then, that does bring about the end of the very, very early style of the horror films, and there's 2 things that I'm going to cover before I sign off this video. Now, the first, it has been portrayed in more films than anybody else. He is quite possibly the most famous vampire that has ever existed, and that is Dracula. Now, according to the Guinness World Book of Records, Dracula has appeared in so many formats in over 200 films. That's one hell of a collection. But ironically, he has only been played by a short amount of people. Christopher Lee is most famous in our modern times, but you also people like Lugosi who played him, who did very well. Lugosi was the Dracula of the 1930s, and he was truly, creepy once he'd put on the makeup. And again, they didn't use a huge amount of special effects. It wasn't like things like Buffy, where when they put on their vampire face, they became very different. No, they just used the creepy atmospherics, because of course they didn't have the big budgets that we do now. And in the 30s, there was a few vampire films that came about, most of them focusing on Dracula. Now, the other famous villain that has appeared in many, many storylines, and it does date back in some regards to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein. Now, the first Frankenstein, the first film, came out in 1931, and that was a James Whale adaptation of Mary Shelley's book. For those of you who haven't read Mary Shelley's book, a version of Frankenstein, it's very, very good. But the problem, and that gave rise to very much the classic imagery of Frankenstein, as in the big square head with the bolts in the side of his neck. and he varies in skin tone from white to grey to green. Very much popularised, of course, in the TV show The Munsters. That was, of course, from the 70s and 80s, I believe, and that was a horror. Well, it wasn't even a horror, it was a comedy, it was a sitcom. It was a sitcom. Now, of course, I've covered off the two major monster villains. There is one other famous monster that comes into cinematics that we know of. That is, of course, the werewolf. Now, the werewolf cinema genre, from what it was portrayed in the 30s, the 40s and the 50s, has very much changed. If you take films like Underworld, how they changed the role of werewolves so differently. The Lost Boys gave depiction of werehounds or hellhounds that guarded vampires when they slept, and that's an idea that's carried on in a lot of films, is that werewolves are the guardians of the vampires. They protect them while they sleep, because of course vampires are vulnerable during the day, you know, locked up in a wooden box, fast asleep, can't go near sunlight, anything like that. Now, Stuart Walker made a film in 1931 of The Werewolf in London, not to be confused with the later cult classic of the 80s of An American Werewolf in London. Was it the 80s that American Werewolf in London was made? Was it the 80s that American Werewolf in London was made? Or was it the 70s? I can't remember. But either way, I'm sure that American Werewolf in London will be something that I will cover in the later decades. The next major wolf film didn't come until 1941, so it's not something that I'm going to go into too much here. That had Lon Chaney Jr. in his first appearance as Larry Talbot, and it was a role that he would go and reprise several times over. So, there are your three major monster villains. Have I missed one? Have I missed a famous monster villain from earlier eras? I have. Though it wasn't really based on anything in particular, it wasn't like Dracula, which was based on Bram Stoker's book of the same name, or Frankenstein, which was based on Mary Shelley's book of the same name, or The Werewolf, which was just very much an adaptation of many modern were myths. The Mummy. The idea of the Mummy came about in relation to people who were terrified of things like the Tomb of Tutankhamun, the opening of the Tomb of Tutankhamun, and things like that, where it was believed to be cursed. Admittedly, they didn't come about until the 1940s, which I will cover in the next video, so I really shouldn't have mentioned mummies at this point in time, but there we go. They'll be covered off in the next video. So for now, that hopefully gives you some idea on the basics of the horror films and how the horror genre came about. From the very early days of 1896 with things like The Devil's Castle, right up to the 1930s and the advent of sound cinema. Of course, back in those days, a lot of the films were still in black and white. And that was true, and you know, a lot of people think you can't make a good film in black and white, but that's personal opinion. My opinion is you can make some very good films in black and white. Sin City is a classic example.
Yeah.
I don't know if you picked the camera picked that up, that was feeling bleh.
Don't
But
like black and white films.
there we go. See? But anyway, I shall return with my with the next installation of this, which I intend to cover the films of the 40s, 50s and 60s and how they continued to shape the horror genre into what it has become today. But for now, this is Silverbolt asking you all, sleep tight.